Hello everyone, I'm Ben and this is yet another episode of Creepshow. If you're into true crime and unsolved cases, as well as folklore and urban legends, which we'll start covering more of soon, please follow wherever you're listening to this at, as it helps out the production and stuff of this a lot. Today, at first, we're going to be talking about something slightly different than usual. So let's get into it. Vampires as a concept date back very far. In fact, the term vampire emerged in Germanic folklore at some point in the 18th century. This is far from the actual origin, I imagine, as most cultures have their own version of these blood-sucking creatures, and tales about them have been around for millennia. It's very hard to find a culture, especially ancient cultures, that doesn't have a vampire in some shape or form in its history and legends. For example, the Romans had creatures called strixes. They were blood-sucking creatures that usually came in the form of an owl or other bird. This term also carried over to witches because they would metamorphosize into the bird. The Chinese have the Jiangxi, which is the notorious hopping vampire. It's a stiff corpse wearing traditional Chinese outfits from the era it is from. They hop around after people with their outstretched arms and consume their life force. In Africa, there's a creature called the Sasabansa, and it's depicted as either a vampire or an ogre. The interesting part is that its teeth are made out of iron, and it lives in trees and attacks from trees. And our final example is the Aluka from Hebrew legend. The word itself, from what I can find, means horse leech, because it would drink from the necks of animals like horses. It's depicted as a leech, like a regular leech, with a lot of sharp teeth. It's also closely associated with the lore of Lilith, or even noted as her direct descendant. My point is that it's interesting to see how many folklore elements are consistent between all these cultures, because they recur across contrasting cultures and contrasting places, and it makes you think that maybe they had or have some sort of basis in reality, or perhaps it's just some sort of statement about people that has endured for incredible amounts of time and persisted in one form or another throughout most cultures and legends. Some say it's probably similar to the way we use the word leech. Of course, what might come to mind first is the animal, a creature that subsists on the blood of another creature by connecting to it and living off of it. But there's another meaning that a lot of us know, which is using it to talk about people who take from others without providing anything helpful, effectively leeching emotional or monetary help from those around them without returning it themselves. With this definition, we could maybe decide that these stories are just elaborate ways to call someone a leech, but who can really say for sure? Honestly, it's probably unfair to call them metaphors at this point, because people believe in much further far-fetched theories all the time. This one at least has explanations outside of the supernatural, which will possibly please what few, I imagine, skeptics we have in our audience today. As a note, in my own personal opinion, I generally believe that supernatural things are based off of something that actually happened. Until proven otherwise by a lot of evidence, it's just how I work. Don't get mad at me for it. The more scientific approach of looking at vampires includes a few medical conditions that may have contributed to the agreed upon traits of these creatures. Even now, there's a old way that they would find vampires. They would exhume a corpse and check if their nails and teeth had grown, which of course was a sign that they were rising at night to feast on the blood of innocents. This one is easily written off, though, and debunked because the skin on a corpse will slowly shrink and tighten as decomposition sets in, making the nails and teeth appear as if they had grown since the body was last seen. Another medical condition that may attribute you to being a vampire is called porphyria. In extreme cases of this condition, it causes a severe reaction and sensitivity to sunlight, as well as strange psychological effects like causing paranoia and delusions. Sufferers of this condition can have their symptoms alleviated through an infusion of hematin. Hematin is an enzyme found in human blood, and it's thought that some people with porphyria will crave human blood. This kinda doesn't make sense though, because it wouldn't help much even if they drank the blood, because hematin cannot be absorbed by drinking it. You have to administer hematin intravenously, so that debunks the theory, but I guess you really don't know. All this being said, there's a few cases of people who believe they were vampires. I'm not talking about the people in New Orleans or, other harmless weirdos. Today we're covering one such case, but first I want to go over a psychological condition, or two psychological conditions, depending on your stance on this. The condition in question is called Renfield syndrome, after the character in Bram Stoker's novel. There was a different name for it at first, going as clinical vampirism. It was sort of an umbrella term for the mental conditions that would cause the craving of blood, and the term Renfield syndrome began unintentionally. A man named Richard Naw intended that use to be a parody of psychiatry of the 1980s, but the joke was taken seriously, and the original term clinical vampirism was replaced. It had doubtful use as it was, but neither syndrome was ever listed as a valid diagnosis in the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual. However, some writers have philosophically pointed out that it does serve a useful demonstration of the bad effects of creating unfounded names for psychological illnesses. The prior diagnosis of clinical vampirism is somewhat different from Renfield syndrome, because clinical vampirism usually connotates an erotic obsession with blood. Renfield syndrome is more of a form of an eating disorder involving living animals, much like the bugs and rats eaten by Renfield in the novel. According to case history reports in the older psychiatric literature that form the basis of Naw's parody, the condition starts with a key event in childhood that it causes the experience of blood injury, or the ingestion of blood, to be exciting. After the subject goes through puberty, the excitement is experienced as, Throughout adolescence and adulthood, blood, its presence, and consumption can also stimulate a sense of power and control. Naw speculated that Renfield syndrome begins with autovampirism and then progresses to the consumption of the blood of other creatures. The usefulness of this label still remains in question, because very few cases of the syndrome have been described, and the published reports of what have been proposed as examples refer to clinical vampirism or Renfield syndrome, but describe the case using official psychiatric diagnostic categories such as schizophrenia or one of the varieties of paraphilia. So as such, Renfield syndrome nor clinical vampirism is recognized by the diagnostic statistic manual. So now, back to what I was saying before, people with Renfield syndrome are often driven by a strange desire to consume the blood of animals or people around them, and as people's nature go, of course there have been a few murders carried out to fulfill this desire. What makes these vampires more worrying than their supernatural brethren is that these ones can't be warded off with garlic or crucifixes, and they almost certainly will not wait for an invitation into your home. What follows after this point is a basic analysis of one such case, the case of a man who was 17 years at the time of committing the crime. His name was Matthew Hardman. Matthew was reportedly a generally normal and well-mannered teenager. He was growing up in the quiet town of Lanfair, PG. If you want to know the actual name of the town, look it up, because I'm not repeating that so many times in this video. It's difficult. There was an exception to his normalcy, a secret obsession with the occult, and of course vampires. A later search of his room would turn up a stash of magazines and books on both subjects hidden in his bedroom away from where people would see them. And the first hints of a possible mental problem with him, or just a possible problem in general, happened in September of 2001. While a German exchange student was staying with him, Matthew told her that he thought she was part of a secret community of German vampires. He would pin her down to a bed and push his neck against her mouth, demanding that she would bite him and make him into a vampire. He also told her that Lanfair PG was the perfect place for a vampire due to the high elderly population. He said that a vampire could kill with no discretion, and people would assume they had all died of old age. Adding to this, he actually knew a lot of the elderly population fairly well. Matthew was running a paper route which usually led him to secluded houses lived in by the vulnerable elderly folks in the town. So it seemed by now his plan was already starting to form. Two months after his incident with the German exchange student, it was now November 24th, 2001. Matthew would be about to commit a horrible crime. After breaking into her home, he would sneak up behind a 9-year-old woman named Mabel Lyshon. Mabel was a widow, and she lived alone. At that moment that he was sneaking up behind her, she was relaxing and watching TV in her armchair. After sneaking up, he would stab her 22 times with a pocket knife before going into the kitchen and retrieving a saucepan. He'd lay this at her feet and make 3 deep incisions into her legs with the knife, draining her blood into the saucepan as she lay there dying. After this, he'd slice open her chest and remove her heart, before placing it on a silver platter he had also gotten from the kitchen. He would then take 2 fireplace pokers and place them in the shape of a crucifix at her feet, before placing a red candle on the mantelpiece near her head. Once this supposed ritual was complete, he'd drink the blood he had collected before fleeing the crime scene. Police were, of course, able to link him to the crime due to DNA left at the scene, and once they investigated him further, they found a murder weapon in his bedroom. After questioning him, they'd give the verdict that he had become dangerously obsessed with the idea of gaining immortality through vampirism. However, they found that he was mentally competent enough to stand trial for murder instead of being sent to a psychiatric center. In August of 2002, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, also reportedly stating after his verdict that going to prison was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to him. Something I forgot to mention: the jury's verdict was unclear until they had removed an order to keep Matthew unidentified. As shown in the picture of him being arrested with a blanket covering his torso and head, once the order was removed, the jury passed the verdict with a unanimous decision that he was guilty. I can't find any current images of him for you to see in the video of this on YouTube, but I did find an article from 2016 that confirmed his ruling was final after the changes of a few things in the UK, and that he'd be spending the entirety of his life in prison, so that's a plus, I suppose. I found this case specifically interesting due to the vampiric connotations. He didn't seem to have an erotic obsession with blood, and he didn't seem to be quite unhinged to call it Renfield syndrome, because the original motive was not just to consume the blood, but become immortal by doing so. I can't think of any other possible motives besides a dangerously obsessive behavior over his vampire and occult books. Perhaps he was just that impressionable, but I can't imagine being 17 and willingly butchering some old lady in that way. Considering that he was deemed mentally competent enough to stand trial for the murder, I suppose there's not much reason to be looking so far into it, I guess. It's just a horribly twisted person. A few write-ups of this case stated that investigators believed that the way he had done it, if he hadn't been caught, he would have become a serial killer. I agree with this assumption just because he did voice his intentions beforehand to the exchange student. So I imagine he'd have gone through with his theory and just killed old people for a really long time if he wasn't caught. So thank you for watching this mini video. I know it's quite a bit shorter than my others, but I'm currently working on a sort of follow-up to my previous thing about Al Kite and Robert Cooper. It's taking a little bit due to the nature of the episode and who it's about, but I'm sure you'll enjoy it whenever it's finished. I'll probably publish this and maybe one more short video in the time between now and when that one is finished. And yeah, if you made it this far, you should probably follow or subscribe because I post at least once a week here. Consider checking it out on all different platforms as well, because we have YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, Reason, etc. It's almost everywhere. And if you know someone else who likes this kind of stuff, send it to them as well if you'd be so kind. Once again, thank you for watching. I'm Ben, and this has been yet another interesting episode of Creepshow.